Hey, Steve Smith.
Hey, Brett Starr. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. How are you today?
Doing great. Just trying to get back in the swing after the Thanksgiving holiday.
How was your Thanksgiving?
It was fun and somewhat restful.
Yeah.
How was yours?
I wrecked my car and my son tried to kill me. My 7-year-old son finally decided that this was the time to challenge his father. And
All right.
He tried to hit me with a stick.
Well, as far as murder attempts go, hitting with a stick is better than other options out there. So
yeah, but he's learning. Now he knows a stick is not enough. So hopefully he gets over this stage before he develops more significant, feudal skills.
Yeah.
So we took a week off during the holidays. We're back at it. A lot happened while we were gone. One of the things that I really wanted to drill into, because I just think it's so interesting, is the marketing outlook survey. So you're doing a survey, your team is doing a survey that basically measures sentiment for, or outlook for everything from marketing investment to company performance to, kind of industry performance, et cetera. This is not a plug, but this is typically the kind of research, because of the access that we have to, an audience of participants. I don't think anyone really, I feel pretty safe saying this. You tell me if I'm overstating it, but I don't think anyone has access to the number of, vendors in work tech or executives or, marketing folks or, board members, investors, et cetera, than the Starr conspiracy. And so when we run a survey like this, we're, running it right into the heart of the work tech category. And this is usually the kind of thing that, people would, this is a really interesting, I'm sorry, I have to go on a little tangent here.
Sure.
But this is usually the sort of thing that people would charge for, right? And we put it out for free, just like we do the brandscapes and stuff like that. And we've heard, from people over the years, you guys are crazy. I mean, it takes months to put together a brandscape. It's taking months to put together this survey and the report associated with it, et cetera. It's a lot of work, and then we just give it away. And we've heard from people through the years who say, "Man, you really ought to be, let's monetize that model. You really ought to be charging for it. Give away an abstract or a summary, and then charge $1,995 for the report, et cetera." And I happen to be having this other conversation with Rachel and the marketing team and, a group of people who are focused on experience management and the Starr conspiracy. So how do you create a dashboard is a weak way of saying it, but a set of metrics that measure employee experience, customer experience, and shareholder experience in a meaningful way, but also show the correlations between those. And one of the unique dimensions that I think is often missed is, okay, well, what are you trying to achieve in your employee experience or your customer experience? That's not really swept up in the typical measures of, employee experience or customer experience, because those are fairly, like stable instruments that are shared across companies and stuff like that. And we really believe that there's a unique dimension to every organization that is a bigger vision or purpose that floats over all those experiences and what you're trying to create in those experiences. And our purpose is to create abundance. And so the goal should be to not promise abundance in, the brand experience and the marketing experience and the sales experience and only get it when you actually pay us something. It's not about promising your vision, but it's actually creating abundance in all of those layers of the customer experience and the employee experience. So how do you create abundance in your brand experience? How do you create abundance in your marketing experience? And so for us, giving this stuff away is not a strategy. It's not a quid pro quo. We do it because we're creating abundance in our marketing experience, because that's our purpose as an organization. And so I've always been incredibly grateful and impressed by just the number of people, the amount of work, the quality of the work, the quality of the research that goes into stuff like this marketing outlook survey. So thank you very much for doing that. Tell me a little bit about the survey. What is it? What's it seeking to discover?
Yeah, really we just wanted to see kind of, coming on the end of the year, how are companies feeling about their revenue expectations for, closing 21 strong. What are they anticipating in terms of growth for 22? What are they investing in terms of programs and that kind of thing? And the results have been very interesting so far. We're still finishing up the analysis, but we got responses from over 400 marketing professionals in workplace tech. And what was really fascinating is, in spite of any sort of macroeconomic conditions, there will be growth. Mm-hmm. But we did find this seam that surprised us of bearish attitudes about how their companies were going to finish out this year, coming from founders. Mm-hmm. So it seems to dovetail with a lot of conversations I've been having with CEOs and founders about kind of headwinds from inflation and things of that nature. And so it was interesting to kind of get that validation that, there's a lot of, I think, reasons for optimism when you see the amount of investment flowing into the workplace technology space. But it does seem like here toward the end of the year, we got that initial burst of activity in Q4 of last year, coming out of the pandemic, lots of investment. We're talking to founders and CEOs saying, yeah, we just had our best month ever, followed by our best month ever. And so there was a lot of growth, and it seems like second half of this year that we're hearing a little bit more, like especially at the fast growth level, the companies that are under 100 million in revenue, more about headwinds. You go over 100 million in revenue, the larger companies are incredibly bullish about how they're going to finish up this year and what next year looks like. But and this won't be a newsflash to you, Brett, because it's the drum you've been beating for over a decade now. The companies, when you cross tab and look at the ones that are experiencing growth at all, are all companies that have invested more in marketing and are going to increase their marketing budgets next year, as opposed to those that are flat or negative.
Well, and just to be clear with regards to that point, what we're talking about is like, whenever a crisis happens, a silly little global financial crisis or, a pandemic or, something like that, there is always a subgroup of companies that pull back on investment and, as they used to say, keep their powder dry. And then there's a group of companies who see it as an opportunity to acquire market share and brand recognition, basically at a discount because there's not as many voices in the market, and media spend sometimes goes down during those periods. And you often say never let a good crisis go to waste, and that's a perfect example of it's like when everyone else is afraid, that's the time to be brave. And I've seen this just in the workups that I've done. You and I are always doing workups of, cohorts of companies in different categories in work tech, et cetera. And I can just draw a big red line between the companies that invested significantly in marketing in 2020 and 2021 and the ones who didn't. And a lot of the ones who did, like I was looking at like Lattice and 15.5 and, a group of, companies in the continuous performance management, recognition, kind of employee experience space. And you've got, a significant group of companies that include Lattice and 15.5 that were growing over 100%, in the last year, just from today backwards, right? And then you've got below the red line a bunch of companies who contracted or, stayed fairly flat or grew 10%. And you can track it right back to, kind of just the attitude around investment during that period. Mm-hmm. But just to be clear, when you say marketing people or founders or large companies are bullish or bearish, you're talking about their outlook on the performance of the company, right? Not the performance of marketing programs.
Yeah, I think the specific question was what's your company's, expected, 2021 top line revenue growth performance.
So go ahead.
And so, and what we found was almost an even split. It was just right around 50-50, 50% expected growth, 50% expected either to be flat or negative.
Did they provide their company names in the responses?
No, this is just in aggregate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Because I guarantee you, what would be really interesting if it were possible is to, basically look at the group with a bullish outlook and the one with a bearish outlook, and then look at, the strategies of those organizations. And I bet there's a strong correlation between outlook and like profit versus growth strategies, or, pullback versus, kind of aggressive investment strategies, et cetera. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's certain things that a profit-oriented company just can't do.
Right.
But there's still, an expectation for, kind of category growth levels that's different between profit-oriented companies and growth-oriented companies. Mm-hmm. And even profit-oriented companies approached these last 2 years very differently. Some, saw it as an opportunity, and some, did the kind of traditional financial thing of like pulling back and, kind of almost going into isolation. Mm-hmm. And you can, really see how it bears out, not just in the actual performance, but in people's perceptions of the prospects of their company from a growth perspective, but also just from an influence perspective. And is it cool to work here or not? It's right. Like, if you put your company in the deep freeze in 2020 and 2021, you probably also lost a lot of people because, no one wanted to sit around and twiddle their thumbs. They wanted to be doing stuff and, showing success during a very difficult time.
Right.
So you mentioned this kind of gap between founders and sub-$100 million companies, or, executives, top executives, and like the marketing executives in those organizations, where the outlook was likely to be more positive for the marketing executives than it was for the founders, who are bearish in many cases. Yeah. What do you read into that? I mean, of course, there's always this, we read something in the Wall Street Journal and we're like, inflation, it's like, oh, impending crash, et cetera. And so we're a little bit more tuned in as, like shareholders to kind of the macroeconomic situation, which often leads to us worrying about things that we don't really need to worry about. But is there any other dynamic that you kind of read into this gap between the bears and the bulls within, the same company?
Yeah, and we're still trying to get all that sorted. But when you're talking to upper C-level and to founders, they're much more bearish. You get into senior VP, essentially, heads of marketing, heads of sales. For the most part, directors of sales and marketing, they're much more bullish, and so there could be a little bit of either a disconnect because there's, on the one hand, in favor of the bearish outlook, there's bad headlines, a lot of negativity, is COVID coming back, those kind of things. But on the bullish side, it's just like, it seems like the professionals that are a little closer to what's happening in reality are more bullish. Mm-hmm. And some of that, too, could be that if you're in sales and marketing, you just naturally have to be optimistic about, I'm going to hit my goal, or I'm going to exceed goal, or next year is going to be the best year ever. And so I think there's just sort of that natural optimism that is always going to occur. And I think that, the opposite side of that coin is also true. If you're a senior leader, it's just like, it's healthy to be skeptical, and it's healthy to be even a little bit paranoid. So I think that there could be some of those more kind of like psychographic traits of certain job roles that are coming into play.
Yeah. Do you think there's also, something that could be read into the gap between, the senior vice president level and the CEO level or board level that's based on transparency in an organization? I mean, it seems strange to me that if, the founder or the CEO or whatever is really bearish about the outlook for their company, and yet, they've got some critical, employees in their organization who are responsible for driving growth, and they're really bullish, that's a significant disconnect. So, do you think it's, and I'm just asking you to speculate, this is not going to be in the data, but do you think that's, an organization where the CEO, perhaps feels like there are challenges, but is not, kind of openly discussing those challenges and just trying to rally the troops? and keep everyone positive?
Yeah, there could be some transparency elements to it. I think also, as you know, any research survey is a snapshot of a moment in time. Mm-hmm. And, this survey was in field, late October through, right before the Thanksgiving holiday in the U.S. And so it seems like there is, when we're 60 days out from finishing the fiscal year, or the fiscal year if you're on a calendar year basis. And then I think just some of the things that you're seeing in terms of headlines, it seems like we've just kind of come out of, or we're in the middle of, just sort of a streak of pessimism in the market. And I think that could be as much of a dynamic as anything. It may not be real. It may just be perception.
Yeah. Something definitely, I know that, given the time period that this, survey was in field, a bunch of stuff has changed. It's like you can't, it's almost like you have to do like a 1-day survey now, just because everything's going to change like the next day. But, there's, I think, growing concern around the health of the stock market, the markets in general, the economy, inflation, and, a bunch of COVID stuff popping up on everybody's radar. I was just having this, doing an interview with someone kind of talking about their experience during COVID. One of the questions I asked is, are we ready for another round if this variant ends up being, more serious than, we may think it is right now, or as serious as some people predict it is, whatever, are we ready for it? Or is it just like, there's been multiple moments during the pandemic where we thought we were turning the corner, and I think we just went through one. And then, a new variant pops up, and it's like, holy shit, is this like gonna, result in another surge and then another long tail of, 6 months and, counting cases again and going back on, to different phases and our return to work plan and all that stuff. And I'm just curious, like, are people ready for that? Are we used to it? Or is this going to be like the, as we used to call the last snow in, New England, the soul breaker?
Right.
Is this the soul breaker?
Yeah. And I feel like that's definitely an element with, kind of what we're seeing with this new, COVID variant emerging, is that, people are clenching up and, putting a little extra bourbon in their cornflakes and that kind of thing. But, I really kind of feel like there's just a line between, I sort of hate to bring it back to the abundance mindset, but it's just that idea of just like, are you looking at this as an opportunity, or looking at this as a positive, no matter how negative it may seem, or, are you looking at it from a fear and scarcity point of view? And I think that it's just like you have to, in the absence of any other information, stay positive until there's some information to cause you to recalculate that.
Yeah, or even just looking for the positive things in it.
Right.
It's the overall experience can be negative, but I mean, there's tons of beautiful stories throughout time of people who have endured much worse things than we're enduring now, who were still able to survive and thrive because of a positive mindset, and just in choosing to engage and involve themselves in things that brought them joy or created opportunities or helped others, instead of kind of retreating into a self-preservation mode.
Well, I think some of this too, Brett, is also just the fact that the tech sector in the markets are overvalued. That's just a statement of fact. And I mean, I think we got a reminder of that, last week or the week before, when Workday posted their earnings, and they were really good. It's like 24 cents EPS. Just made a really nice acquisition of Vindley. They had a lot of good stuff to report, and immediately their stock drops 10%. And some institutional investors moved out of that position with them. And so it's just sort of like, it was a really kind of a WTF moment of, it's just like, when a major growing brand posts a great earnings report and they get killed for it in the investment market, what's going on? And it's just, I think, some of it is the unrealistic expectations that a lot of investors have about growth, or, the kind of stocks that they want to be in, kind of seeking more short-term returns rather than long-term growth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, there's just so many, I mean, it's such a complex time to run a business, and it's also a complex time to work in a business. And there are so many factors that, in combination, we've never really experienced before. Mm-hmm. And, I know that people often feel frozen or, et cetera, around, what to do with all of this information, and, kind of how to stay focused on what drives value for their people and their customers, and, et cetera. And, I can't help but think that anybody who, just kind of going back to, COVID specifically for a minute, anybody who thought that they shouldn't invest in creating a great work experience in a virtual context, or in the context that, people were working in that had changed. So there's some people who can't work virtually, but there were still significant changes to the way they work, people in manufacturing facilities, stuff like that. And, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of people said, well, this is a short run thing, so let's just, kind of go into crisis mode. We're going to get back to normal soon. And then it kept dragging on and dragging on. And, now here we are, almost 2 years later, and there's another variant on the horizon. There's, a lot of uncertainty in the economy, very reminiscent of March, April, and May in 2020. Mm-hmm. And if people are still not creating a work environment to support, a good work experience that leads to a good customer experience and a good shareholder experience, if they're still not making those changes, I just don't think that they ever are. Right. But surely this is evidence that regardless of whether there's ever a return to normal, mm-hmm. That there has to be some recognition of the need to enable people and support them and create a great experience when things like this happen, or when organizations, even if it's temporary, have to work remotely or change, kind of the way they work.
Right.
But I don't, there's a lot if people are on that track. I mean, tell me what you think, but I think if people are on that track of not wanting to bend to the zeitgeist, they're just going to stay that way. And, maybe they make it, maybe they don't,
Yeah, I mean, just, it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of Darwinian. It's just like you have to evolve as an employer to meet the times, because they're not changing. If anything, we're, accelerating toward a very different way of working. And, the companies out there who are saying, hey, you know what, let's wait. We'll all be back in the office eventually, and we'll all be getting on airplanes and mm-hmm. traveling again. It's all going to be the way that it was in 2019. It's just like, that's just not going to happen. I mean, across the board, whether you're a white-collar professional knowledge worker, or you're in a blue-collar, field industry, everything is changing. What are you doing to be prepared for what the workplace is going to be like a year or two or 10 years down the line?
Yeah, and it reminds me so much of so many moments in history. We've talked about technological determinism on kind of previous podcasts, but when email was becoming a thing, the company that I worked for, when email was coming into offices and stuff like that, mm-hmm. they put up a kiosk. They put up one computer in the office where you could go and check your email. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want people to be checking email during work hours unless they were on a break or at lunch or something like that, because they perceived it to be, such a disruption. And, it was probably temporary anyway, and this whole fad around email was going to, go away, and then, we could all get back to normal. But you had so many people who were fighting against it, and then you had so many people who embraced it so rapidly. And then the same thing happened with social media. You still have organizations who want to, spy on their employees, find out how much social media they're using, block it, inside organizations and stuff like that. And so they fight against that as if, social media is not an important part of the social fabric that we have, et cetera. And, it kind of brings me to this point of like, you should ask your people, do you want it to return to normal?
Yeah.
And so there's all these companies who are trying to tilt back into normal, but they haven't actually asked their people if they want it to go back to normal. And, we did a travel survey last week because, we're trying to think about our travel policies as, information about COVID changes, et cetera. And I was really under the impression that, everybody wanted travel to get back to normal, and there was all this pent-up demand for business travel, and we asked a lot of questions about, preference for business travel versus, preference for personal travel, and how important is it and critical to, being effective at the work that you're doing, and or is it an interruption, or et cetera. And, it was just another data point when the results came back. A very small group of people actually thought business travel was important or critical to their job, or that they enjoyed it from a work experience perspective, which is great for them. Fantastic, let's put them on planes if that's what they want. It's important to their work experience, and they feel like it helps them, perform their job well. But a lot of people were like, travel's an interruption. I never want to go back there. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of, issues like that where if people just asked their, employees what their attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs are around certain things that used to be considered normal, I think that they would be a lot less resistant to adopting change. Like, a distributed, semi-decentralized, semi-autonomous, workforce, at least in the knowledge worker, sector, is becoming a strong preference for people. Autonomy in work and flexibility in the work experience, and being able to work from home or move or whatever. And if people are forcing people back into the office in that context, they're probably going to lose a bunch of folks.
And that's great news for us, because as a digital 100% of the time business, we've been able to recruit some great people who are fleeing that.
Yeah.
And we're not dependent on location. We've been able to hire globally fantastic talent. And, it really, I think it has been more disruptive to the recruiting environment than anything that I remember ever, just in terms of making companies that maybe can't compete necessarily on salary able to win on employee experience and quality of life.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had a life's too short moment,
Well, and also, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that, back to your original point about, basically decision making at the highest level of organizations, I think we get clouded by the fact that, we work in a world of employee surveys and work with companies that are selling all of these solutions, whether it's, measurement or surveys or sentiment analysis, things like that. I think that most companies don't bother to ask the questions, either because they don't feel like it's important. Strategy happens at the top level and it cascades down to everybody else, or they're afraid of what the answer is going to be, or they know the negativity they're going to run into, and so they go to great lengths to avoid finding the answer to the question.
Yeah, and I think there's an undercurrent there of like, I think a lot of people just kind of intuitively and subconsciously believe that there are just parts of a job that suck, and you just have to suck it up and do it, right?
Yeah.
And, that might be true to a certain level, but it doesn't have to be completely that way. If there's like, it's like, it reminds me of that story. I used to work with a guy a long time ago whose motto was do what you dread most first. And, that seemed like really a logical thing. It's like, go attack the stuff that you dread most first, and then you're freed up to do all the stuff that you really want to do. And I had a epiphany, a couple of years after being exposed to that philosophy, which is, if you're always doing what you dread most first, you end up mostly doing shit you dread.
Right.
So why don't you do the stuff that really brings you joy first, and then generally the stuff that you dread either falls off the list because it wasn't important to begin with. But if it seems to me like if you're just constantly doing stuff that you think sucks, that's a great recipe for getting really good at it and continuing to do stuff that sucks. And so I think that, we should break free of this belief that there are just parts of a job that suck, and you have to do them anyway. So people aren't asking these questions because it's just they view it as table stakes of that job. It doesn't matter to me whether you like that part of the job or not, because that's just kind of part of it. Well, good luck competing for, talent with that kind of outlook because people can be very picky right now. And this is different. This whole situation is different than tight labor markets that we've seen in the past.
Very much so.
It's been cyclical before. Sometimes the labor market's tight. Sometimes, it's not, et cetera. It's not only tight right now. It's like people are making different decisions about whether they even choose to work or, whether they stay at home and trade crypto or, like move to a cabin in the woods or, whatever. And people have a lot more in their mind, and in reality as well, have a lot more options to create the life experience that they want. Working's part of it, but if there's a persistent kind of component of a job that just sucks and sucks for most people, you can't just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's just part of the job.
Right.
It's like do something about it.
Well, yeah, and I think that coming out of the way that things had always been in the workplace. I mean, like, you go back to when we were young and coming up in the 1900s, with our slate tools and our spears and those kind of things and our Fred Flintstone cars. It's just like that was sort of the attitude. It was just like, you pay your dues, you're going to eat a lot of shit as a young employee, you're going to do a bunch of shit work. But that's just part of how things go moving up the career ladder. And it's just like that attitude. You can't compete for talent and win with that attitude today. Because, I mean, the youngest people in the workforce will give you a big middle finger and say, I'll find somebody who actually wants to listen to me, where I can be a value contributor. So,
yeah. Well, going back to the the survey, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about, and I took us on like a 2-hour.
We'll fix it in post.
Yeah, fix it in post. COVID detour. You also looked at basically investment levels and different types of tactics, and one of the ones that really caught my eye was, I mean, it feels strange to even be saying it, but investment in virtual events seems to be going down, and investment in in-person events, at least the outlook for 2022 is that it's going to be going up.
Yeah.
What's going on with that? I mean, part of me when I heard that was just like, well, people never really figured out how to do a virtual event. It's different. It's complex. They didn't get good at it. So,
I think that's part of it, but I also think that, we spend all day, in Zoom or Teams or whatever your video conferencing solution of choice is, and I just don't think that at the end of the day, after doing all that most people want to go spend a bunch of time in a virtual event, going to a virtual expo floor or any of those kind of things. And so I think that that's part of it too. I think that it's just sort of like Zoom fatigue, and so that I think is an element, but also, I think that another element to it could be that dynamic that we were talking about earlier of just like, hey, I want to get back to something I know and I'm familiar with. And certainly within B2b marketing and tech marketing for, ever, events have been a huge source of driving leads, gaining brand awareness, and that's just it may be some wishful thinking on the part of respondents to the survey of, hey, we want things to get back to normal.
What was the split between virtual versus in person, like people who are reducing versus increasing spend in virtual events, or what kind of numbers are we talking about?
I don't have that. I don't have the results here in front of me. It wasn't huge, but it was noticeable. Yeah. It was when you kind of look at the stair step, it was definitely it was noteworthy. So,
but the headline is that people are reducing their investment in virtual events and increasing their investment in in-person events
for 2022. Yeah, 2022. That's what we're seeing now. Whether or not that comes to pass, we'll see.
Yeah, and I think you can't discount the invisible hand of industry here. Right. It's like when you think about the organizations who put these events on, and I'm talking about not the company branded events, but the big trade shows and all that stuff. They just don't make as much money on virtual events.
No, they don't.
And that's not their core competence. They've often got dozens or hundreds of people who for the last 20 years have been putting on large in-person events. And so you're talking about a complete digital transformation inside a company. And so it's in their best interest to get back to, fully, attended live events as quickly as possible. And, that's going to come out in the way that they promote and advertise. And, they've got kind of a captive audience because a lot of the media providers, every vendor is going to be on their list. And so they just get to pump, marketing to them all the time and, promote the event, et cetera, et cetera. And so at some point it starts to normalize the notion that people would go to an event.
Right.
Of course, it's totally normal to show up to Vegas with 30,000 people during a pandemic and walk around in a hotel and, eat shared food off a big platter. It's like, yeah, I'll take one of those donuts. So I don't know. I think, there are, I think about well-being and benefits a lot, and how screwed up, healthcare is from a corporate perspective. And the conversation that we don't often have is the invisible hand of industry there, how the carriers and the brokers and, all of these like old school industries want to keep things the way that they are, which means incredibly complex, which means increasing in price all the time. And so they just have this effect on, how benefits gets done. And I think the same thing, kind of happens with events and, other areas where we don't often think about, the underlying structure that wants to drive, a certain outcome.
Well, I think also, talking about benefits, one of the things that also kind of jumped out last week is just this surge in on-demand wage access and on-demand payroll with, UKG launching a new product in conjunction with a provider in that space. Ceridian doing the same thing. And what I also thought was noteworthy was basically we've seen in benefits kind of a reinvention of voluntary benefits and bringing sort of like this financial wellness and wage access component into voluntary benefits that are more focused on creating a good employee experience rather than providing another plank in sort of the total comp platform and total rewards platform. To me, that's interesting, and I think some of that has been a really good response to, people having, running into difficult financial circumstances during the pandemic. But I think that's, a good example of sort of innovation in the benefit space. But it's also, I think, back to your point, innovation sort of forced the hand of maybe the most traditional and conservative audience kind of within workplace technology, which is that kind of that broker, carrier, consultant audience.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of earned wage access as an example, and I think you're right. It's a perfect parallel because it just makes perfect sense. The only thing that kept earned wage access from, kind of being adopted in the mainstream earlier was that it's just a pain in the ass to think about undoing a traditional payroll process that's been in place for, 100 years, where, of course, employees get paid monthly or, every 2 weeks or whatever. And there's a big payroll run and, there's, error checking and, overtime equalization checking and, all that stuff. And it's just too hard. We just can't do it. Well, it's their money. It's like if they work a day, then they've earned, that portion of the salary for that day. It's their money. And by the way, if you can make it more liquid, if you can create a liquid, kind of exchange of compensation for, work completed, you kind of steer people away from predatory lenders, from payday loans, from, all of this egregious, financial infrastructure that wants to put people in permanent debt and just earn interest off of them like they're farming Soylent Green or something for the rest of their lives. So I also have to ask about B2b Gifting because that was something that came out. It's going to be in the WorkTech Weekly newsletter. And something that was in the industry, our internal industry briefing. What is B2b Gifting and what's going on?
Yeah, it's something that has been coming up quite a bit with brands like Goody and Snappy and Gifted, and it's really this whole trend of how do you get the kind of business gifts that you give to employees, you give to sales prospects, you give to customers, how do you do that? That kind of like that gifting in an environment where maybe people aren't in the office or are just otherwise maybe, like say, not wanting to get your fruit basket, and so seeing all of these companies just starting off with more kind of a B2C aspect, but really coming hard into B2B. And I think that one of the things that really kind of surprised me is knowing that there's sort of this overlap with employee rewards in the rewards and recognition market, and knowing that the global market for employee rewards is something like $100 billion these days. Getting into like what is the environment for, or the total addressable market for B2B and employee gifting, and it's like something like double or triple that in theory. Now, as you and I both know, total addressable market numbers are 95% of the time total bullshit. But that really kind of jumped out at me just in terms of these are changes that are going on in the workplace that in 2019 that wouldn't be an issue. And I mean, we send out a lot of gifts, and so it's just like if we want to send wine out, or we're doing some sort of a dimensional mailer campaign either for ourselves or a client, that wasn't an issue. Now that is all completely changed. And so how do you deal with that changing dynamic?
So is the value add here, the notion that these consumer organizations are coming into B2B gifting, is the value add that they actually have the residential addresses and channels of delivery to get into people's homes and can correlate that to basically where they work? Is it just easier for them to get something into someone's home from a B2B gifting perspective?
No, most of these are just like you can send a at its probably its easiest is you can text somebody a link, and then they can go either access the gift and have it sent to them, or select the gift that they prefer. So very much like the experience that they would have in a employee rewards situation. Anyway, I mean, I think I'm just interested in that entire category because you've had some companies get some significant funding rounds around that, but it's just another example of how something that really wasn't on the table 2 years ago suddenly is a growth opportunity within sort of workplace technology.
Yeah, I mean, we were writing, articles and making recommendations, early in 2020 about in-home marketing. So, it's a leap for some people to think of out-of-home marketing when it comes to work tech. Some big brands have made that leap. But I was really focused for a while on in-home marketing. So how do you reach people who are suddenly working at home? And we put together some plans for, basically using Nextdoor because everyone was, they had Nextdoor up on their monitor because they were working at home and they wanted to see what was going on in the neighborhood while they were working, or, over-the-top marketing on streaming services and stuff like that to reach B2B clients. And one of the things that became really clear, has become really clear over the past 2 years, is that the traditional channels of marketing, if you're driving for personalization and you want to get outside of the digital sphere, we've got to, start thinking about different ways, to engage with people where you can't just send something into the corporate mailroom or,
Right.
Rely on some of the, just old ways of doing things. And I think it's an incredibly creative period, an opportunity to find ways to, market to people without pissing them off.
Yeah, and very much so. And I mean, it's just like, when you bring that into sort of a demand generation ABM aspect, we're seeing some really interesting innovations come up in that realm of, great, so you can't send a dimensional mailer to a prospect. How do you then recreate that experience in a virtual way? And so I think that, I look at it as being really fun and very much a creative period, just as you do.
Yeah. So are you working 2 jobs right now?
No, I'm not. But there was this really interesting article in The Guardian about that. Evidently, the secret double lives of white-collar workers with 2 jobs. And, I think that... I'm fascinated by this because I have a friend who runs a tech staffing agency who told me a really hilarious story about one of her contractors who they were doing, it was I think they were doing iOS or Android app development, and they were doing a morning check-in, and this guy goes through his check-in, and then they keep going, but then they hear the guy doing another check-in for a completely different project, but he didn't hit mute on his Zoom. And so she realized, oh my God, this guy who I'm paying a lot of money has another job where he's making a lot of money. And so she Zoomed him right after and said, hey, you're fired. And he's like, what? And he's like, dipshit, you didn't hit mute. You're working 2 jobs. He's like, oh yeah, you're right. I guess I am fired. So,
yeah, I'm totally fascinated by that story because on one hand, it's a story as old as time. Like I remember back in like 1999, there were 2 people at a company that I worked at who it was discovered that they were salespeople, both of them. They were working 2 sales jobs.
Oh wow!
And so it's always kind of been there, right? That people were moonlighting, but in a kind of a full-time capacity.
Yeah.
But so I just love the behavioral economics and the just human element of someone who's willing to have 2 full-time jobs in the kind of this knowledge worker context or whatever. But there's also this part that fascinates me of like why that's possible.
Right.
And I think it's completely possible if you are incredibly disciplined about how you spend your time and how you manage your ability to get into deep work states and stuff like that, because of all the incredible inefficiency that often exists in a typical work experience. If you're able to take personal control of the inefficiencies in your work experience, you actually could free up enough time to work 2 jobs in a traditional environment.
Well, that's the thing is, on the one hand, you sort of have to admire the initiative of these people, where it's just like, hey, they're working 2 jobs. But I mean, I think it plays into the fears of a lot of employers of like, oh, I do need to be spying on my workers because they're going to pull shit like this, and I don't think that's true either. So,
well, hats off. I mean, I think everybody wants more money, more, everything or whatever, but how many people are actually willing to work 2 full-time knowledge worker jobs to get their money?
Well, the funny thing is I read an even more interesting story about this guy who was working like an overnight shift in basically kind of a manual data entry job. It was a second job, and he very rapidly figured out, hey, this can be automated. He went to the extent of hiring a software developer to automate the job. And he had this job for like 5 years, and he basically didn't have to do anything. He was offered promotions. He was like, no, I'm good. Because it was just a second job, and it was completely automated. Stuff would hit his email box and all of this stuff, and he didn't have to do anything.
Well, there was a period when like all of these, virtual assistants were popping up like around the globe. And I remember reading all these articles in the Times about employees who had basically outsourced their job, to, executive assistants or, just other, people on like, Upwork or something like that. And were just having their work done for them. So, man, super creative. I often feel like, I wouldn't quite, put that in the fraud category.
No.
But, there are some aspects of gaming the system and hustling and, being a rounder that, kind of fits into that category. And I just often wonder what would happen if people took all this, creative problem solving capability and like put it to work, against, some big objective instead of just, trying to figure out how to hustle people.
Well, but the thing is I think what it does point to is a lack of connection and purpose to your primary job. I mean, if you're like a software contractor, it's just like you don't have any skin in the game with your company or your culture. It's just a gig and a paycheck, and it's just like if you're an employer and you have employees who are doing that kind of work, it's just because they're not invested in what's going on. And I think that's the bigger question of if employees feel like that they're building careers, that they have purpose, and they connect to the purpose of a culture, you're not going to see them holding down 2 jobs and trying to do that hustle. That doesn't mean that they're not going to have a second job somehow. I mean, when you're working with designers or software developers, it's just like you sort of know they're probably moonlighting or doing something on the side anyway. But as long as they're visibly committed and getting work done, great.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't care personally. Like, having 2 full-time jobs is probably going a little too far. But
yeah, that is.
Yeah, people can spend their personal time any way they want. If they want to do freelance work or whatever, I don't really get wrapped around the axle about that, because they're either doing their job or not, and that's all that we're really kind of focused on from our work experience perspective. But
exactly. So, like, if you have a sideline, say for instance, as a private investigator, that's okay.
Yeah. I've got some great stories. I just finished another case actually yesterday. But anyway, more on that in another episode of Whatever This Is, which is not the actual name, but there probably really is no name. So anyway, man, it was good catching up with you, and glad we're back in the studio, and looking forward to catching you next week.
All right. Hope you get your truck fixed.
God bless America.